Hello and welcome to the History Crew channel. In this video, which serves as part 5.2, we will discuss the international anti-apartheid movements and the various forms of boycotts which were organized, in order to put pressure on the apartheid state during the 1980s. Even after the shootings at Sharpeville in 1960 or the harsh repression of the Soweto uprising in 1976, the South African apartheid state was still in power. However, there was now much greater awareness on the international front of the injustices of apartheid. The government was widely criticized, both by Western governments and at the United Nations. Protest demonstrations were held in many countries, and calls were made for the sporting and cultural isolation of South Africa, as well as for economic sanctions. And in spite of the huge internal pressures on the government during the 1980s, the apartheid state still did not collapse. It was the added pressure of external factors that created the climate for change. During the 1980s, international pressure on the government increased significantly, in response to P.W. Botha's attempts at reforms, as well as the harsh and brutal repression of resistance movements within South Africa. It was becoming clear to the rest of the world that apartheid was evil and must be stopped. International anti-apartheid movements, sanctions and boycotts, the ANC in exile, and support for the resistance struggle by the frontline states in Africa all played a role in ending apartheid. Leading the international resistance movements were the anti-apartheid movements in Britain and Ireland. The anti-apartheid movement in Britain was formed in 1959 by South African exiles and their supporters, at the request of ANC leader Albert Luthuli, to create awareness of what was happening in South Africa. It immediately attracted wide support from students and trade unions in Britain. The Irish anti-apartheid movement was set up in 1964, to further plan resistance campaigns against apartheid South Africa. In the 1980s, the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was firmly opposed to sanctions against South Africa because she wanted to protect British investments in South Africa. She also feared the communist influence in the ANC and saw them as a threat in the Cold War era. The ANC was indeed receiving support from the Soviet Union, and the apartheid government would falsely justify their brutal tactics as an attempt to stop communism from spreading in southern Africa. Margaret Thatcher's response was very significant because she was a powerful leader of one of the most strongest capitalist nations in the world, and was not willing to take a stance against the apartheid regime. However, as a result of many of the citizens from within her country who defied their leader and took action, the international anti-apartheid movements were able to ensure that South Africa became increasingly isolated and under immense pressure from outside the country now too. It was regularly criticized by the United Nations, and many countries supported a ban on the sale of arms to South Africa. Many people protested against their own governments, who sold weapons to apartheid South Africa, because those weapons were being used against the oppressed people of South Africa. You must take note that even though the leadership of a country might have been weak and was not willing to take a stand against the apartheid state, many people from within their own country defied their own governments, and organized protests against South Africa. This would eventually put pressure on their leaders to take action. Another way of isolating apartheid South Africa was through sports boycotts, which were organized by international anti-apartheid movements. South African teams were increasingly isolated when they were barred from international competition, especially after many countries adopted the Gleneagles Agreement in 1977, which called on members of the Commonwealth to cut all sporting links with South Africa. Not all Commonwealth governments, though, supported this, such as New Zealand, and the Springbok rugby team still toured New Zealand in 1981. However, the massive protests which took place in New Zealand basically split New Zealand into two, and that showed the risks of disobeying the sports boycotts. Most sporting links with South Africa then ceased in the 1980s, as no other country was willing to go through the same chaos which was experienced in New Zealand. You must take note that even though many citizens of New Zealand were against the tour of the Springboks, it was the government of the country at the time that allowed the tour to take place. This may have been due to the personal opinions of the members of the government who supported apartheid South Africa, but this once again shows that a government of a country may not accurately reflect the citizens it represents. There were also cultural boycotts organized by the anti-apartheid movements which put further pressure on apartheid South Africa. The British Actors Union, Equity for example, would not allow the performances of any of its members to be shown in South Africa, and as a result many British TV programs and films could not be shown here. Many international stars did not want to visit South Africa. The number of television programs which the SABC could buy was very limited. This form of isolation and pressure was severely isolating and weakening Apartheid South Africa. The anti-apartheid movements further intensified their resistance against Apartheid South Africa through consumer boycotts. Although South African products were available in British shops, many consumers applied their own sanctions by refusing to buy products from South Africa such as fruit or wine. This had a huge negative impact on the economy of the Apartheid South Africa, which was the desired effect. The economy grew weaker and the government of Apartheid South Africa was facing a lot of external pressure, because the consumer boycotts were taking place in many other countries too. Academic boycotts was another form of resistance against Apartheid South Africa, and professors from South African universities were refused admission to some international academic conferences. For example, in 1986 South African delegates were excluded from the World Archaeology Conference in Southampton, even though many of them were strong opponents of apartheid and their research had disproved many apartheid myths about the history of black South Africans. South African scholars and academics were isolated from the academic world by this boycott, which further isolated the country and intensified the pressure against Apartheid South Africa. The anti-apartheid movements were successful in coordinating resistance against Apartheid South Africa, through protest actions such as boycotts. The apartheid state was under immense pressure, and that would only worsen because of other forms of international resistance. This will be covered in the next video, so please stay tuned to the channel. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, please remember to subscribe to the History Crew channel.